The girl collapsed just past the last fence post, her breath ragged, dress torn, and one moccasin missing. Dried blood ringed her ankle like rusted wire, and her skin was sunbaked and trembling. She didn't cry, just reached for the basin by the trough and drank as if she didn't care who saw her die there. Jeb Carter had been watching from the corral. He didn't move at first, thought maybe it was a trick, or maybe a punishment from God, or both. He'd seen too many things crawling out of the desert, half-men, ghosts, regrets. But something about the way she curled her fingers around the water, slow and reverent, like a prayer she wasn't sure would be heard, made him cross the dirt in 4 long strides. He didn't speak, just knelt by her, dipped his hand in the water, and held it to her cracked lips. She flinched, then drank Dot up close. She looked maybe 15, maybe older, with a kind of face that had never known kindness without a price. Her hair was pitch black and matted with dust. A faded deerskin pouch hung from her neck, clutched like it was the only thing that hadn't tried to hurt her. She said nothing, not even when her body gave out and she fell against his shoulder, barely breathing by the time Jeb lifted her into the barn. The sky was rolling in violet and fire. Dusk always came sudden on the plains, the kind that made you remember every mistake at once. He laid her on the old hay bed behind the ox stall, covered her with his wool coat, and waited. He didn't sleep, just sat by the open door, cleaning his rifle, one eye on the horizon. Something felt wrong. Not like danger, more like consequence. The kind that rides slow but sure. That dawn they came. No sound but hooves, no dust, just row after row of figures. On horseback, like a painting that had come to life. Dozens of them, faces painted, spears upright, eyes locked on the barn, silent as judgment. Jeb didn't reach for his gun. He just stood in the doorway, hat in hand, and waited. He understood. You don't touch what ain't yours, not out here, and she was theirs. But then an elder dismounted, moved slow. His braids were white, his face carved deep with time and knowing. He stepped up to Jeb, looked him dead in the eye, then looked past him to the girl asleep under Jeb's coat. His gaze softened. He nodded once, and just like that, the tension dropped like a snapped fence wire. Some of the riders eased their grips. A few even looked toward the horizon, like maybe they hadn't come for war. Not yet. Still, none of them spoke, and neither did Jeb. He just stood there, boots planted, heart thudding like a drum. Sometimes, silence is the loudest kind of trust. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she'd run, or how far. All he knew was that she was bleeding, and thirsty, and scared, and no one else had offered her a drink by noon. The riders were still there, watching, waiting, and the girl finally opened her eyes. The girl didn't speak for 3 days. She moved like a branch bent too long by wind, careful, brittle, and always listening. At night, she kept to the shadows of the barn, never asking for more than the coat Jeb had given her. She watched the horses like they held some secret she was trying to remember. Sometimes she'd hum under her breath, low and broken, like a tune, passed down through sorrow. Jeb didn't push. He brought her water, fresh bread, and slices of smoked deer when he could spare it, set them down near her bed of hay, and left without a word. That's how things lived on his land, quiet, half wild, and broken in their own ways. On the 4th morning, she stepped out of the barn, barefoot in the dirt. She stood like she belonged to the earth more than 2 people. Her eyes were dark, unblinking. They caught Jeb as he hauled a bucket to the trough. She didn't speak, but the way she stared held something old, like she was weighing him against every man she'd ever known, and not finding him heavy enough to hate. "Name's Jeb," he said. She said nothing. "Yours." Her fingers twitched at the pouch on her chest. She clutched it tight, like it held her name and every story too painful to say aloud. Then she turned and walked past him, toward the ridge, slow and barefooted. The riders were gone, had vanished by the 2nd morning, as if their presence was meant to mark something, not fix it. But their silence still hung over the land. Birds didn't call, coyotes stayed to the distant hills. Only the wind moved, dry and thin as regret. Jeb found her later sitting by the stream near the cottonwoods, her back to the water, braid undone. She was running a blade across a strip of leather with the precision of someone who'd done it since childhood. Her hands were calloused, nimble. Whatever life she'd lived before, it hadn't been soft. "I ain't gonna ask why you ran," he said, setting down a tin cup of coffee by her side. "Just glad you did." She didn't answer, but her fingers slowed. He sat near her, far enough not to crowd her silence. For a long while, the only sound was the ripple of the creek and the slow cut of leather dot. Then she whispered, "They sold my sister." Her voice was rough, unused, like something broken and newly glued. "They came at night, took the horses, said she'd be safer with white folks. Safer than with a tribe the army don't count as people no more." Jeb stared at the water. He thought of his own sister, buried young from fever, hands still small and cold as milk. "I tried to stop them," she went on. "They beat me, left me with the old women, said I was too wild to fetch coin." Silence. She looked at him then, really looked. "Why'd you give me water?" Jeb didn't answer right away. He thought of the war, the burned farms, the eyes of men he'd buried, half of them still boys. Thought of the time he'd left a child crying by a riverbank, too wounded to carry, too scared to stay. "Figured you were thirsty," he said. She nodded. Once, not quite belief, but something close. Maybe gratitude, maybe just the start of it. That night, she returned to the barn on her own. She swept the floor, fed the horses, stacked the woodpile without being asked, and before she lay down, she spoke one word, Wanya. It hung in the air like smoke. Jeb said nothing, just tipped his hat and walked out into the dusk, letting the quiet settle where trust was starting to grow. She'd been sold, beaten, left behind, but now, someone had said her name, and someone had heard it. Wanya started waking before the rooster. She'd milk the cow, sweep the porch, even patch the barn roof with her fingers raw and bandaged. Jeb didn't ask her to, but he didn't stop her either. They understood each other in the kind of silence only people who'd lost too much could share. The land had its own way of mending wounds. The breeze that rolled off the ridge, the hush of dawn when frost still clung to the trough, the rustle of grass when the horses stirred. Wanya began to listen to it again, and Jeb, without meaning to, started listening to her. He watched her teach a colt how to trust the bridle, not with rope, but with song. He saw the way she traced her fingers across the carved feathers of the old wind chime that had hung useless from his porch for years. She fixed it with a strip of her own leather and hung it back up. It sang the next time the wind came. Jeb hadn't heard music in years. The war had burned that part out of him. Virginia, Shiloh, names that meant nothing out here, but still woke him up some nights with fists clenched and eyes wet. His wife, Clara, had died before the last frost of '62. Fever took her in 3 days, took the child with her. He buried them beneath the apple tree, the only one that still bloomed some springs, as if her breath still clung to its roots. Since then, Jeb had lived like the ranch, half running, half rotting. Nothing left to build, no one left to stay. For just the rhythm of fence posts, cattle drives, and the steady march of quiet. But Wanya brought something different. Not soft, not easy, just alive. He never touched her, never even sat close, but he fixed a loose board in her stall, replaced her moccasin with a new pair he stitched himself, left her a woven blanket he'd once wrapped around Clara's shoulders. She never asked where it came from, just folded it carefully each morning, as if it belonged to someone who mattered. One evening, she followed him up the north ridge, said nothing, just walked beside him as the sun dipped low, painting everything gold and lonely. They sat near the edge, the land wide and endless below them. "Why do you stay here?" she asked, voice low. Jeb pulled at a stem of dry grass. "Because running didn't fix anything." She nodded. "My sister's name was Aya." He turned to her, waiting. "I used to think if I kept walking, I'd find her. Now I just hope she doesn't forget the way our mother sang to us at night." Jeb reached into his coat, pulled out a small tin. Inside, a locket. He didn't open it, just held it in his palm. "She's buried under that apple tree," he said. "Clara, my girl." Wanya bowed her head, not out of pity, out of knowing. That night, she lit a small fire by the barn, burned a handful of sage, sang something old and soft into the smoke. Jeb watched from his porch, hands trembling, hat clutched against his chest. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the ache. Sometimes, two broken people don't need to fix each other, just to stop breaking alone. Autumn crept in without announcement, just a shift in the wind, sharper now, and the way the light leaned longer across the fields. The leaves near the stream turned to copper and ash, and the mornings brought a fine mist that clung to the porch rails like breath not yet spoken. Wanya began humming more, just under her breath, while folding the saddle blankets or grinding corn near the hearth. Her voice wasn't strong, but it was steady, the kind that made silence feel less like an emptiness and more like a pause. Jeb noticed her rhythm matched his without meaning to. She moved through the ranch like she'd always known its bones, when to feed, when to mend, when to leave space. They rarely spoke, but when they did, it was with purpose. No wasted words. "You ever ride?" he asked one morning, watching her brush the chestnut mare Dot. She gave him a look like he'd asked if she knew how to breathe. "Since I could stand," she said. He saddled the mare himself, cinching the strap with slow care. She mounted with the grace of someone born to the animal's sway. Her braid whipped behind her as the horse took to the ridge. Jeb watched from below, hat in hand. There was something sacred about seeing her like that, free, upright, unchained. He began teaching her the finer cuts of the land, where to find the best wild onions, how to read the clouds for late rain. In return, she showed him how to mend broken leather without splitting the sole of it, how to dry herbs for fever, how to listen to the woods and tell who was passing without seeing them. Evenings turned quieter. They sat by the fire, one outside, the barn, built low, flames licking just enough to warm the hands. She carved small figures out of driftwood. He smoked a pipe he hadn't touched since Clara passed. There was peace in the stillness between them. One night, the first snow came, not heavy, just the dusting that painted the corral fence and turned the roof pale as bone. Juanita stepped out barefoot, lifted her arms to the falling white. "Where I come from," she said softly, "the first snow is the breath of the ancestors. It reminds the land not to forget us." Jeb stared at her, the snow catching in her hair. He thought of all he'd forgotten, of all that had forgotten him. That night, he lit a lantern inside the barn, left it glowing by her stall. He found it still burning in the morning, but beside it lay a small figure carved in wood, a horse with a single feather at its neck. Sometimes healing doesn't shout, it carves. It stitches, and lingers. And in the hush between two lives, it begins again. The first sign came with the tracks, bootprints near the West Creek, deep and careless, not from any local rancher, too wide apart for a farmer, too heavy for just one man. Jeb saw them at dawn, crouched low in the frost, eyes narrowing. He didn't need names to know what kind of men left marks like those. He'd ridden with them once, long ago, when he still believed law wore the right face. That night, he bolted the doors. Juanita sensed it before he spoke. She moved through the barn like prey does through brush, alert, breath tight in her chest. When he finally told her, his voice was flat. "Someone's looking, probably brought coin." She didn't ask who, just pulled her pouch from under the straw mattress and tied it tight against her chest. "It's for me," she said. Jeb didn't nod, didn't speak, but he reached for his rifle the way one might reach for an old wound. Familiar, reluctant, necessary. The next evening they came, 3 of them, long coats, Union hats turned backward, pistols slung low and loud. One rode with a whip coiled at his belt, the kind not used for cattle. Their horses were lean and restless, not meant for staying. They reeked of whiskey and command. The man in the center, older, with a moustache like old rope, stepped forward, eyeing the barn, the porch, and Jeb. "You took in a runaway," he said. "She don't belong here." "She's got a name," Jeb said. "That's so." The man spat. "Well, that name come with a bounty, and I aim to collect." Juanita stood behind the door, listening, not trembling, just watching, like she'd already lived this moment in another town, another barn, another life. Jeb stepped forward. "Ain't no law says you can buy a girl and call it justice." The man smiled slow, mean. "Ain't no law says you get to keep her neither." No one moved. The wind rustled the fence line. A hawk screamed overhead. Jeb tightened his grip on the rifle. "She's not going anywhere with you." Silence. Then the man laughed. "You'll kill for her." Jeb didn't answer, but Juanita did. She stepped out then, barefoot, the wooden horse tucked into her hand. She looked at Jeb, then at the men. "My sister's gone," she said. "I'm not." The one with the whip moved, but not fast enough. Jeb fired once into the dirt, near his foot, not to kill, just to tell them he could. "You ride out now," he said, voice low, "or you'll see what happens when a man's got nothing left to lose." But his word, the silence after that, was longer than it needed to be. Then the men turned, muttered curses, rode off. Dust hung in the air like breath held too long. Juanita didn't thank him. She just stood there, eyes burning, the wooden horse, held tight to her chest. Inside, Jeb sat by the fire, hands shaking. "You should run," he said, not looking at her. She walked to him, slow. "I did," she whispered. "And look where I ended up." Sometimes, protection isn't a wall. It's a man who doesn't turn away when the past comes calling. The snow came heavier after that, thick, quiet drifts that covered the corral fence and bent the branches low. The world shrank to the sound of firewood popping and the steady creak of the barn roof under weight. Days passed slow. Time moved like molasses over old wounds, but neither of them left. Jeb knew the men would return. Men like that always did, not for justice, but for pride, for coin, for the need to remind the world they were owed something. He trained Wanya with the rifle, though she already knew how to hold it. What she lacked wasn't skill, it was permission. To fight back, to stay. She never said she was afraid, but she kept her pouch tied tight and her boots by the door. On the third night, they returned. This time, they didn't knock. A bullet tore through the barn door just before midnight, splitting the wood like thunder. Horses shrieked, flames caught. Fast, they'd thrown oil. The fire danced quick, orange and cruel. Wanya ran through the smoke, barefoot, eyes wild. Jeb met her halfway, pulled her behind the well wall, rifle in hand. She looked at him, not pleading, not anymore, just ready. "They want me," she said. "Let me finish it." He shook his head. "You're not something to trade." She stepped past him, into the firelight. The flames caught her shadow against the barn like a spirit, rising. "Then let me speak," she said. And she did. She walked into the clearing, smoke behind her, and faced the men with nothing in her hands but her name. "I am Wanya," she called out. "Daughter of Elk Woman, sister of Aya. I am not property, I am not coin, and I will not be silent." The men laughed, confused, uneasy. Jeb stepped beside her. He raised his rifle and leveled it at the leader's chest. "You heard her." The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was recognition. These weren't just outlaws anymore. They were men facing a truth they couldn't outrun, that not everything could be broken and sold. "I buried my wife under that tree," Jeb said, his voice ragged. "And if you try to touch her, I'll bury you next to her." The leader looked at Wanya, looked at Jeb, looked at the barn burning behind them. Then he turned. No gunfight, no blood, just retreat, defeat that didn't need bullets to count. When the horses disappeared into the dark, Jeb dropped the rifle. Wanya fell to her knees. The barn burned to the ground. They didn't speak, they just watched it collapse. The place that had held their silences, their healing, their beginning. And when it was over, Jeb sat beside her, pulled the blanket from his own shoulders, and wrapped it around her. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Some words don't need repeating when your life has already spoken them. Morning came slow, pale with ash from the night's fire. The barn was nothing but a skeleton now, charred ribs against the sky, smoke still rising in soft curls. But the land was quiet again, still, like it had exhaled. Jeb didn't speak much that day. He hauled what he could from the ruins. The horses had survived, scattered but unharmed. The carved figures, blackened but intact, lay near the foundation, and he set them on the porch rail, side by side, as if watching over the land. Wanya stayed by the apple tree. She sat with her knees drawn close, her pouch open in her lap. Inside were feathers, beads, a scrap of cloth too worn to name. She buried them one by one beneath the roots, whispering words too old for Jeb to know. When she finished, she laid her hand on the bark, eyes closed, face wet with the kind of tears that don't fall in fear, only in memory. Jeb brought her water and didn't ask. They rebuilt slowly. Not the barn, not yet, but the porch rail got fixed. The stove in the bunkhouse got cleaned and lit. Wanya moved her bedroll inside. Next to the window where the light came in soft at dawn, she planted something near the ruins, not for food, just color. Yellow blossoms from the canyon trail, said nothing about them, but tended them each morning with care. And Jeb, for the first time in years, found himself speaking aloud when he fed the horses. Little things, observations, questions, words meant for someone else to hear. It didn't matter if she answered, she heard him. That was enough. One night, after a frost, he found her standing by the tree again. She held the wooden horse in her hands, turning it slow. She was smaller, fierce. They stood in the hushed dot. Then she said, barely above the wind, "If she finds her way back, she know I stayed." Jeb looked out at the fields, silver with moonlight. He thought of all the things he'd waited for, and all the things he never dared to. "She find you," he said. She smiled then, just a little, just enough, and for the first time since Clara's death, Jeb dreamed without grief. The ranch wasn't loud, it never would be, but it was no longer silent. Since that morning, the earth sang again in footfalls on the porch, in the rustle of blossoms by Ashwood, in two voices side by side, asking nothing but presence. Winter settled soft over the valley, not cruel, just honest, the kind that teaches you to move slower, to listen deeper, to value warmth not as comfort, but as survival shared. Wanya took to rising before the sun. She walked the land barefoot still, even in frost. Said it helped to remember where she came from, the feeling of earth cold and alive under skin. She'd bring in kindling, tend the morning fire, and hang cedar branches near the windows. Small rituals, sacred. Jeb began writing again. Not much, a few lines in a leather-bound book Clara once used for shopping lists. Now it held sketches of the horses, notes on the weather. One page had a name written again and again, Juanita. Sometimes he caught himself saying it aloud, not by accident, but with intention, like planting a seed and trusting it would take. The ranch didn't grow louder, but it grew full. They built a new barn together, thicker walls, lower roof. She carved a wind symbol into the doorway beam, said it would keep the past from settling in the rafters. He let her, he wanted it there. One morning, a rider came, young, nervous, wrapped in a threadbare army coat, carried a parcel with no return name, said only that he'd been paid to deliver it, west of the ridge, to the girl with the eyes like smoke. Wanya opened it alone. Inside, a doll made of twine and bone, worn, but intact. She held it for a long time, didn't cry, just sat beneath the apple tree, eyes closed, arms wrapped tight around her knees. "She's alive," she whispered later, voice hoarse. "She remembers." Jeb said nothing, just stepped out into the cold, chopped more wood than they needed, and left it stacked high by the door. The fire burned long that night. No one came back for her again, no riders, no threats. Just wind, snow, time, and the girl who had once run, until her feet bled, now walking, steady, head high, across her own field. Spring came early the next year. The apple tree blossomed bold, white and sudden. Wanya sang to it one morning, bare palms resting against its bark. Jeb watched from the porch, his hat in his hands. She turned once, looked back at him. "Don't wait by the gate anymore," she said. "This is the place." He nodded, then smiled, small, tired, real. Sometimes, a man spends his whole life waiting for something he can't name, until someone gives it back to him. If she ever left again, he wouldn't stop her, but he knew now she'd return, not because she owed him, but because they'd built something neither one had expected to survive, belonging. And in the hush that followed, the land breathed again.